Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching this. Um, this week, we're going to focus on the United States Constitution and the six big ideas that are found in it. Um, First off, it's important to remember that the Constitution that we operate under today is our second form of government. Our first Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation, if you remember. And with the Articles of Confederation, while it did help successfully bring the Revolutionary War to its conclusion, had a number of problems. Those problems included it had a weak national government. Now, this was developed because of how the founders felt about the British form of government and British control over the colonies, which they saw as a very strong centralized form of government. So they wanted the opposite of that. Congress had no power to tax. They wanted to leave the power to tax to the individual states. Congress was left to asking states for donations to help fund the government at the national level. So obviously, this was not going to work well for the national government. Um, Congress could not regulate commerce. So individual states were negotiating trade agreements with each other as well as other nations. Um, this becomes a problem as you will have fighting or arguments amongst the states themselves. There was no common currency. Each state um, minted their own coin. Each state printed their own money. So the different values. Each state obviously has placed their own value on their money versus the other states. This also becomes a major problem. So right now, under the Articles of Confederation, you can see that each state was effectively operating as its own separate government. And when it came to the national government, each state had one vote in the legislature, regardless of its size. So states with smaller populations had equal representation with states with much larger populations. And there was no executive and no judicial branch under the Articles of Confederation. So no ability to make sure the laws were being carried out, and no ability to determine if laws or actions by the government were just, were legal. So again, you had a number of different problems with the Articles of Confederation, and this is what ultimately leads to its initially it was supposed to be an amendment to the Articles, and ultimately resulted in just scrapping them altogether. So I'm going to give you a quick little outline of the Constitution before I go over the six big ideas. First off, we begin the Constitution with its introduction, also known as the preamble. And with the preamble, it goes over the purposes of what the Constitution is intended for, and basically saying what it's going to do to correct the problems with the Articles. It's to form a more perfect union. Obviously, under the Articles of Confederation, our country wasn't united. It was really a combination of 13 different countries established justice to make sure laws are being carried out and being carried out in a fair manner, to ensure domestic tranquility. As I mentioned, the states, actually there was infighting among the states, even states really coming to the ends of declaring war on one another in some cases. Providing for the common defense. The national government under the Articles had no ability to tax, so they had no ability to raise a standing army to defend the entire nation. Promoting the general welfare. to help out or deal with the needs of the people in general throughout the nation, which is something the Articles could not do because of how weak the national government was, and secure the blessings of liberty and our posterity. So to make sure that we are able to have a government that will maintain the freedoms that we won in the Revolutionary War and make sure that those freedoms endure into the future. Now we get to the meat of the document, starting with Article 1, which Article 1 outlines what the powers of the legislative branch, the lawmaking branch, are. It establishes a bicameral legislature, a bicameral Congress made up of a lower house called the House of Representatives and an upper house called the Senate. And there are specific powers to each branch, but the laws are made at this level. And it's very specific as to the types of laws that they are able to make. This is followed by Article 2, which deals with the executive branch. So it adds something that the Articles of Confederation didn't really have. Yeah, there was a president that presided over the government, but they had no power really. So under the Constitution, there's an executive branch that is established to enforce or carry out the laws made by Congress. And then finally, the third part of our government. So we have three branches of government. We have the establishment of a judicial branch. This is probably the most vague of the first three articles. It doesn't really mention exactly what the rule is, other than determining things at a national level, being the decider when it comes to disputes among states or with the national government. It talks about that there will be a Supreme Court, but doesn't exactly say what the role of the Supreme Court would be, or even how many members would make up the Supreme Court. All those things are determined later on, and eventually the rules or the role of the Supreme Court gets specified in Marbury versus Madison, but we'll save that for a later week. So, first three articles make up our government, make up our three main branches. The founders actually believed that the legislative branch was the most important. That's why it's first, and why it actually makes up, word for word, makes up over half of the Constitution. Next, we have in Article 4 the states, and in this article it outlines what the role of the states is. Really, this gets underscored by the 10th Amendment. Then in Article 5, it describes the process for amending the Constitution, that 2/3 of states are required to propose an amendment, and then 3/4 are required to approve of that amendment, to ratify that amendment. And it's a very difficult process, and a main reason why we only have 27 amendments to our Constitution, despite it being around for over 220 years. Article 6 states that the supreme law of the land is the Constitution, that the Constitution is the final say as to the powers of the federal government, and how the federal government ultimately has the last say. Regardless of what laws the states may want, the states can only do those things that aren't accorded, those powers that aren't accorded to the federal government. And then finally, Article 7 mentions that the Constitution will become the official law of the United States once 9 out of 13 states decide that it will be. Followed by the Constitution as part of a compromise to appease those who felt the Constitution took away too many rights from the people and the states, are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution called the Bill of Rights. We'll deal with some of these at a later time, in later weeks. But the Bill of Rights essentially establishes what the rights of individuals are specifically, as well as the rights that are reserved to individuals and the states. So, as I mentioned earlier, this week's lesson deals with what the 6 key ideas of the Constitution are. So I'm going to start off with limited government. Government is not all powerful. The government can only do those things the people have given it the power to do. And that's through our representatives. The Constitution gives power to the national government, and they're very specific as to what the national government can do. So this is a big concept in the Constitution, that the power of government is, in fact, limited. Republicanism. This is a political system that embraces freedom, that the rule of law applies to everyone, that no one is above the law. This is a concept that really originates with the Magna Carta. And a political authority comes from the people. This is not necessarily democracy, but it does use democratic principles. The people give the government authority by way of their representatives. Checks and balances. Each of the 3 branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the national government, the branches of the government limits the exercise of power by the other 2 branches in very specific ways, and these are stated in the Constitution. For instance, the legislative branch makes the laws, but the executive branch has the ability to veto those laws. But in turn, the legislative branch can overrule those vetoes, but it needs a larger majority in order to do that. The executive branch makes appointments to the judicial branch, and they pick their own advisors. However, the legislative branch has the final say. So while the president may want certain people to advise them, the Senate decides who ultimately can go in to be an advisor to the president, an official advisor to the president, or not. Members of the Supreme Court are chosen by the president, but the Senate has the final say as to whether they get to be on the Supreme Court or other federal courts. Spending bills originate in the legislative branch, specifically the House of Representatives, but the executive can veto those. But the executive makes recommendations as to what should be spent. Plus, the executive, being one person, has the ability to speak to the entire nation. A lot easier than in the legislative branch, where you have individual motives for each of the representatives. They want to represent their people, and it's harder to really have one cohesive voice that can speak out to the people. Now, the judicial branch can determine if the laws or actions of the other 2 branches are unconstitutional, but they are in turn in check because they are there because the executive branch chooses them and the legislative branch approves of them. So those are some of the specific ways that each of those branches check the powers of the other two branches. Federalism. So government power is divided between the federal or national government and the state governments. That the power of the federal government is supreme. So in a way to try to create a more perfect union, the states are able to make certain laws, but ultimately the federal government has the final say as to what is the law of the land. And really that begins with the Constitution. Our first form of government was a confederation, the exact opposite of this. The states had the power to determine things, and the federal government, well, the national government really was useless. It had very little power, had very little influence. It did not create a united nation. Separation of power. Government power is divided into three parts, so no part of government has the control of all aspects of that government, of the government. So the legislative branch, they make the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. And the judicial branch decides if those laws are just and if they're being followed, if they're being enforced justly, legally. So these are actual limits on power. So it's connected to some of the other concepts. And then we have popular sovereignty, that the people are the source of the government's power. That government acts on the consent of the people by their elected representatives. That people do not care for the laws being made by the government. They have the ability to vote those people out. In a way, we have little mini revolutions every 2 years when it comes to the Senate and the House, that we can decide if we want to keep our representatives or get rid of them. Every 4 years, we have the ability to either keep who is president or vote them out. So the government that we have is there because we allow it to be there. So your activity for this week is you're going to use the Constitution and you're going to go through and find 2 passages that apply to each key idea. So a total of 12 passages, and explain them in your own words. You are also going to indicate the number of the article, section, and clause. Now, with the link that I provide for you, you're going to go to the transcript. A lot easier to read. The article will be clearly noted. The section will be clearly noted. As for the clauses are paragraphs. In some cases, the paragraph is only a sentence long. So if you have a section, the section may be divided into 2 parts, or it may be divided into 3 or 4 parts. So, for instance, you might have Article 1, Section 1, Clause 2. So that's one of the things that you will be doing on this. The worksheet that you're going to need and the link to the transcript of the Constitution will be provided on the Microsoft Teams site as well as my class site. Now, extension work. For those of you who are looking for a little additional work, you're going to look at constitutional compromises. How does the Constitution come to be? How do we get 9 states to agree to it? Well, you're going to start off, I'm going to provide a link to the crash course video on constitutional compromises. After watching the video, I want you to do some additional research on each of the compromises mentioned in the video. And after doing your research on a separate sheet of paper, or you send me an email of a Word document, or just in the email itself, I want you to reflect on the short and long-term impacts of each compromise that was made to get the Constitution ratified. And then, what have been the positive and negative impacts of these compromises. And that's it for this week. The main reference to this week's lesson can be found in the National Archives. We're dealing specifically with the Constitution of the United States at archives.gov. If you have any additional questions, remember that we have class from 8:30 to 10 on Thursdays, and then my office hours are from 12 to 1:30.